Hello, this is Dr. Jenkins, and here we are for our chapter on the senses. This is going to be a pretty quick little lecture, a pretty quick chapter. The senses, it's kind of hard to find a place for them to fit in, but they're still important enough that they deserve and they need their own little chapter. So, here we go. Of course, as is with the case with most of our chapters, we're really only covering the basics. And when we talk about our special senses, we're only going to be talking about a couple in detail, just because of time. All right. I want to point out first that we have general senses and receptors. So we'll talk about those first. And then we'll switch gears and talk about the special senses, what you think of as the senses. Vision, hearing, touch, etc. So I just want to point out, we have sensory receptors all throughout. So in terms of senses, we think about our eyes and our ears. This is how we take in the world. So we have to have these tools in our body to take in data, to take in the world. We need to know, if you think about it back in like caveman, cavewoman time, it was all about protection. You have to be able to see danger, smell it, hear it. So we have all these senses as our way of experiencing the world and really alerting us to danger. When we talk about senses, as I just said, we know we have the special senses, vision, touch, hearing, smell, but we also have general sensors. And specifically, we have to have these sensory receptors. So all throughout our skin, we have these specialized receptors. And these specialized receptors in our skin are constantly sensing for things, whether it's touch, temperature, pressure, because our skin is really our barrier to the outside world. So it makes sense that we have these receptors that are sensory. They sense all sorts of things. And there's different types. So I'm only having one. I guess I was feeling nice when I made this PowerPoint. Ha ha ha. We have specialized receptors that they themselves sense for pain, some kind of painful stimulus. We also have specialized sensors that sense for changes in chemistry or temperature or pressure or light. The point being that each individual sensor or receptor is only specialized for one thing. And therefore we have a variety of sensors, each specializing in one thing that allow our skin to experience the world. And then of course, what do these sensory receptors do? They send a message to the brain. Oh my God, there's painful stimulus, and our brain processes that and sends out an appropriate response. So that was a really quick, and I mean really quick. When I'm talking about quick, I mean quick, folks. That was our really quick general senses. But let's spend time getting a little more detail into our special senses. Taste, smell, vision, hearing, equilibrium. These are in and around the head, and they're much more specialized. You think about our ability to see, a lot has to go into being able to see as well as we do. So it's not just the same as our general senses that sense for one thing or another. It's a much more complex anatomical and physiological operation. So of these, we're only going to be covering the vision, hearing, and equilibrium. We're not going to talk about smell or taste. We're going to talk about hearing and equilibrium and vision. All right, so let's first talk about hearing and equilibrium. You can see I went on a little fun thing about animal pictures. So get it, hearing, the dog is barking. Yeah. Look at this dog over here. Sometimes it's those quiet ones you got to worry about though, right? So let's talk about the basics of our ear anatomy. This is how we're going to bring in the sound waves. We're going to process the sound waves and then send that specific sound wave information to the brain. So we're going to separate the ear anatomy by outer, middle, and inner. The outer ear here is purple, the middle ear is blue, and the inner ear is green. Let's go one by one. The outer ear. Okay, make sure you know these structures. We first of all have the auditory canal. This is the canal that our sound waves are going to enter our ear through. The outer ear, by the way, which is made up of elastic cartilage, as we know, is called the auricle. You might hear it called pinna in animals. So think about, have you ever thought, why do we have this outer cartilage? And it's really just to help direct the sound waves into the auditory canal. Okay, let's keep it nice and simple. Let's talk about the middle ear, or what's in blue. So if we were to trace the path of sound waves, they're directed into the ear by the outer auricle. They enter the auditory canal, and now they're in the middle ear. Those sound waves are going to hit the eardrum, otherwise known as the tympanic membrane. Please know it as tympanic membrane. And this eardrum, it's a really thin flap, and much like, if you know anything about an orchestra, we have the timpani drum. It's the drum that kind of sounds boom, 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 boom. But the idea is the drum, the top of the drum, it's a thin layer of fabric, specialized fabric, that vibrates and it makes sound. So similarly, our tympanic membrane, those sound waves come in and they will vibrate the eardrum or tympanic membrane. Those sound waves come in and they vibrate the tympanic membrane, and the tympanic membrane is then going to transfer or transmit those vibrations to the next part of the ear anatomy, which is the ossicles. These are the smallest bones in the body, malleus, incus, or stapes, otherwise known as hammer, anvil, and stirrup. And this is kind of like the old mousetrap game. So the tympanic membrane is vibrating, which will vibrate the malleus, which will vibrate the incus, which will vibrate the stapes. So these small bones transfer vibrations from one to another. There are some other structures. They're not in red, so you don't have to know them, but I do, just for information's sake, let me point out the auditory tube or eustachian tube. You don't have to know it, but I'm just pointing it out. Here it is. So there's basically a canal, an opening from the middle and inner ear, and it goes all the way to the mouth, the throat and the mouth. So what this does is it's an open tube or canal, and it allows us to equalize the pressure. This is just really cool and interesting. It's really important. But to try and make your life a little easier, I'm just picking a couple of things for you to know. But you've probably experienced this. If you go up in elevation, higher altitude, or even go up an elevator to a high floor, your ears start to pop. And what is one way to equalize that buildup of pressure? Open your mouth, chew gum. The idea being we open up this canal by opening up our mouth, and we can release some of the pressure that's building up. Pretty cool. So this is already what I've said. Here it is written in words. If we were to follow the path of sound waves, they would enter the ear directed so by the auricle. The sound waves would travel through the auditory canal. They would cause the eardrum or tympanic membrane to vibrate, which then causes the ossicles to vibrate in order. So the tympanic membrane, the vibration will transfer to the malleus, which then transfers the vibration to the incus, and then transfers the vibration to the stapes. Now we're going to get into the inner ear. And those vibrations, they've been transferred all along. And where are they going? The cochlea. And this is what looks like a seashell, right? So now we're in the inner ear, and we're going to focus first on the cochlea. This is my dog. Unfortunately, in the years since I've made this, she has passed away. But there's my Allie girl. Hi, forever in my heart. So let's first talk about the cochlea. We are going to talk about the other two major parts of the inner ear, but let's first start with the cochlea. So we just learned that all the sound waves are transmitted into the cochlea. This is the part of the inner ear that processes the sound waves. Every other part was just conduction. I want to bring the sound waves through. Eventually, we get them to the cochlea, and these will contain the specialized cells that help to process the sound waves. How many sound waves, at what frequency, at what intensity, and so forth. Now, I am going to get a little bit more specific because it's really cool. So here's the cochlea, right? And if we were to take a cross section, it's got this greener part, which is kind of more hollow, greener parts. But we want to look at the cochlear duct, this middle region, because this middle region, if you were to look at it under a microscope, it has little hairs, little cilia, some outer and some inner. These, you get a really good sense of what the hairs kind of look like. They're kind of flapping in the breeze there. So what happens is when those sound waves come in, the sound waves move the little cilia, the hairs. And depending on the duration, intensity, frequency, all these things, depending on all those things of the sound waves, the hair cells will bend or sway more or less in a certain direction. And the swaying, the movement of these hair cells causes the cells underneath the hairs to send a message to the brain. So the cells underneath, because the cilia, they're kind of like on top of the cell. So the movement of the cilia, or hairs, the cell underneath sends information about that movement to the brain. And that's how the brain processes and makes sense of what we're hearing. It's all about the movement of little hairs. I think that's really cool. Okay, here are some things that could go wrong. You don't need to know these. Just extra. Otitis media is the fancy word for an ear infection. This picture is pretty simple. That's why I like it. It just shows gunk built up, right? So if we have stuff building up in the middle ear, hence the word otitis media, and you can feel that if you have an ear infection, it's kind of clogged. This is what a normal tympanic membrane will look like through an otoscope. It's a thin little fibrous membrane. Well, when you have an ear infection, it will inflame the eardrum or the tympanic membrane, and it could look like this. Pretty easy to see the inflammation. Ooh, this is a ruptured tympanic membrane. Yikes. You don't want to have that, right? Then if it's ruptured like this, you're not going to be able to have the vibration of the tympanic membrane. You don't need to know this. I'm just showing you things that could go wrong. All right. The other two parts of the inner ear are the vestibule and semicircular canals. And these function in balance. And this may not be a surprise to you, but it might. So the inner ear, obviously the cochlea is going to process the sound waves. But the other two parts of the inner ear balance. So we rely on our inner ear for balance and equilibrium. More specifically, the vestibule helps us with static equilibrium. And that just means that the vestibule helps our body know its position in space when we're at rest. Versus the semicircular canals, which help our body know its position in space when you're moving. Let's first start with the vestibule. I mean, it might at first be a little hard to comprehend, but let me give you an easy example. If someone puts a blindfold on you and you can't see through it, okay? Well, without the aid of your eyes, because, your eyes can also help your body know where you are in space, but we also rely even more on our ears, our inner ears. So if you put a blindfold over your eyes and you were dangled upside down, hung up by your toes, hung up by your ankles, dangling upside down, even with your eyes closed, wouldn't you know you were upside down? Even if you move your head and then close your eyes, you still have a sense that you're not upright. So this is how our vestibule works. When our position changes and then we're just staying there, static, we're not moving, we can still know where we are in space, versus the semicircular canals will help us keep balance while we are running and jumping or twisting. Dynamic equilibrium. So let's talk about them. Here's our inner ear. We already discussed the cochlea. It's the conch shell-shaped thingy. The semicircular canals, well, they look like semicircular canals. One goes this way, one goes this way, and one goes that way. And then the vestibule, a little bit harder to comprehend, but it's just the base. So this region here, just that region is called the vestibule. Let's talk about the vestibule. So the vestibule is kind of the base. So this square is mostly around the vestibule. The vestibule is responsible for static equilibrium. How does it do it? All right. If we were to look more closely at the vestibule, it actually has two parts, the utricle and saccule. One part is up here, one part is down there, but you don't need to know those, okay? What I want to focus on is a specialized area, and it is in purple. So we got a specialized area here, purple, and a specialized area here, purple. Inside those specialized area are the macula. These are specialized receptor cells. And sitting on top of those receptor cells, called macula, are otoliths. And I'm not joking, folks. These are like little jelly-like stones. Little calcified, tiny little stones. So if we imagine, we can imagine, and I'm just simplifying this, imagine we have these cells, 4 cells side by side, the nucleus in the middle. And on top, so these would be the macula. So we have these specialized cells called macula in that purple region. And sitting on top of the macula are little jelly-like stones. And those stones are called otoliths. They're just sitting on top of the cells. Okay. Let's look on the right. So let's focus on the purple areas, macula, have those specialized cells. Look at these specialized cells. They're kind of rectangular, right? These cells also have little cilia, but there's also the otoliths, the stones. What happens when you change position? The little stones shift. Think about putting little pebbles in a jar. And if you turn the jar sideways, don't the little pebbles move? If you turn your head sideways, literally the little pebbles in your ear, in your vestibule, they move. And it is the movement of these. Maybe they move this way. Maybe some move that way. It is the movement of these little stones that moves these hair cells, which causes the cells underneath to send a nerve impulse to the brain about that movement. I know. So if someone says, what do you got, stones in your head? You can say, as a matter of fact, I do. In the macula specialized area of my vestibule of my inner ear, I have otoliths. And when we move, they change position, which signals the movement of hairs, which signals the cells underneath to send a nerve impulse to the brain via the vestibular cranial nerve. You might get smacked in the head, but... So with the vestibule, the little stones change position. And when the stones change position, they move the hairs. And the cells underneath will then send a nerve impulse to the brain. It's kind of genius in its simplicity, isn't it? It's pretty cool. All right. Now let's go back to the semicircular canals. The semicircular canals, they're semicircular, they're little like loops, right? They help us maintain balance while we're moving. So instead of having the otoliths, so in the vestibule, because the vestibule is over here, the vestibule had movement of stones or otoliths. On the other hand, let's go in green. Here we have the semicircular canals. This time, we're looking at movement of fluid. The idea is pretty much the same. When you move your body or your head, this fluid moves. Right? Fluid might move one way, fluid might move the other. So when that fluid moves, the hairs also move, and then the nerve will send information to the brain about that movement. Same idea, we just utilize fluid versus little jelly-like stones. The last thing I want to point out is with the semicircular canals, let's see how much you're on point here. What do you notice about the orientation of the 3 semicircular canals? What do you notice about the orientation of the 3 semicircular canals? Think back to our first chapter, terminology, other, anatomical position. It's hard because I can't see you to see if you're really thinking. What I'm getting at is, you ready? There's a semicircular canal in each plane of the body. Oh, we've got a semicircular canal in the sagittal plane. So if we move forward or backwards in the sagittal plane, we've got a canal oriented that way to pick up the movement. We've got a semicircular canal in the frontal plane. So if we move right to left, we have a semicircular canal oriented in that position to sense it. And we have a semicircular canal in the transverse plane. So if we twist, moving in the transverse plane, we've got a semicircular canal in that plane. Genius, isn't it? Absolutely genius. All right, let's talk about the eye. Okay, this time, instead of talking about the anatomy from outer, middle, inner, like we did with the ear, we're going to talk about more like a surface. So imagine the eye as a ball, because it is an eyeball. It's round, spherical. We have an outer layer that goes all the way around the outer part of the sphere, a middle layer that also goes all the way around the sphere, and an inner layer. Sometimes these are called fibrous, another word for outer. Middle is also known as vascular, and the inner is known as the, not surprisingly, internal. Look at that. Let's go layer by layer. Before we do that, we have to talk about the fluid components. Now, the back region of the eye is filled with something called vitreous humor, and it is more jelly-like. It's trying to show you, it's kind of like a jellyfish, maybe? it helps to keep the shape of the eye. Whereas in the anterior chamber, if we're just looking at the front, the anterior chamber is filled with a more aqueous humor, which is more watery-like. It's not so much gelatinous, it's more watery. These are the two liquid components of our eyeball. In the front, anterior chamber, aqueous, watery humor. In the back, posterior, larger part of the eye, is the vitreous humor, more gelatinous, like a jellyfish, helps to keep the shape of the eye. All right, at the bottom is the cow eye. Pretty cool. Let's start with the outermost layer. Remember, we're talking about layers. What color can I use here? It's going to stand out. Green. We're talking about layers that go all the way around. So this outermost layer, most of the outermost layer is called the sclera. It's reasonably thick, and it's kind of rubbery, which is really nice because it gives structure, but also it allows the eye to handle some stress. Because I've dissected the cow eye, which is very similar to the human eye, you know what it reminds me of? The sclera reminds me of a racquetball. If you ever played racquetball and the ball's rubbery, or if you think about a tennis ball, once you take off the fuzz, the inner bit is rubbery. So it's a little flexible, but it's pretty strong. So the sclera is that outer rubbery covering. It went outside the lines there, sorry. It goes all the way around, except for the front. The front of the eyeball has a thicker area. And this is the white of the eye that you can see when you look at someone, and it's the cornea. So it's pretty much continuous. The sclera blends into the cornea, but the cornea is a little bit thicker, and this is what we can see in the front of the eye. So the sclera is the outer covering everywhere else. The cornea is the outer covering in the front. Let's talk about the middle layer. The middle layer is called the choroid. Now here it's showing up as red. Okay, it's this red inner layer that again goes all the way around. Okay. It tends to be quite dark though, maybe almost like dark blue or black in a human organism, even in the cow eye too. They're using this red because it's very vascular. That's why this layer is called the vascular tunic, so it has a lot of blood supply. So let's start with the middle layer called the choroid. Goes all the way around. Once we get to the front portion of the eye, we have some other structures that are still considered middle layer of the eye. The iris is the colored part of the eye. Check it out. My eyes are blue. I know you haven't really seen me maybe, but my eyes are blue. So if your eyes are blue, the iris will be blue. The pupil is simply an opening. So the pupil, folks, is just the opening. It's the opening through which we let light rays in. The lens is this structure. It's pretty fibrous, and it's able to change shape because what happens is we bring in the light rays through the opening or pupil. It hits the lens, which is pretty fibrous, but it does have the ability to bend a little bit. So it can contort itself to refract or send those light rays to all portions of the retina, which what we're going to find is the retina is the inner layer of the eye. So in that way, just like the lens of a camera helps to focus, quote unquote, the lens in your eyeball takes these light rays and refracts them to the appropriate place in your retina. The inner eye, look at me. The innermost layer here is shown as yellow, right? Goes all the way around. It's yellow. So what you're seeing here is the retina. And the retina is a specialized membrane that contains the cells that process vision. Because as I said, the light rays come in, the lens will bend a little bit to refract those light rays where they need to go. And then the retina just contains a bunch of cells that process the vision. Much like the cochlea processed our sound waves, the retina processes our light rays. As an FYI, there is a spot in the back of our eye. This is not in red, so you don't need to know it. But there is a little area called our blind spot. It's right at the same spot where the optic nerve comes in. So if a light ray happens to be refracted to that specific region, there are no rods and cones there that can process the vision. So there is a part in your periphery where you have a blind spot. Okay. These are the rods and the cones. This is actually the histology or tissues. So we have the outer layer, sclera. Remember I was saying the choroid, it looks red in the picture, but it's actually quite dark. There's the choroid, which means that this whole inner part is the retina, chock full of specialized cells. Rods and cones are the big ones. I would like you to know this, actually. So let's put a red beside it. The rods help us with vision at night, and the cones help us with processing color. I just think about C and C, cones and color. That's what I think about. So here it is, putting it together. I've already said this, but here it is in written form. So we're going to have light rays enter through the pupil, open spot. It hits the lens, which will change its shape to refract light rays to all parts of the retina. The retina contains those specialized cells that process our visual information, the rods and cones. And then eventually, like everything else, that information has to be sent to the brain via a nerve. And of course, what nerve would it be? The optic nerve. All right, there we go. Nice and quick. If you have any questions, let me know.